The late 1960s in California was a time of golden dreams and open roads, a moment when the sun-soaked beaches and sprawling hills seemed to promise freedom, love, and possibility. Teen girls in particular embodied the era's carefree spirit, barefoot, wild-haired, and rebellious. It was a time when hitchhiking to the coast or running off to San Francisco felt less like a risk and more like an adventure. But not every girl who fell into the family's orbit was a runaway from across the country or a hitchhiker drifting west. Many were California girls long before Manson arrived, raised in the sunshine, shaped by surf culture and canyon nights, already steeped in the freedom and looseness of Southern California living. These were girls who grew up on the edge of Hollywood, who wandered the Venice boardwalk, who thumbed rides up the PCH because everyone did. They weren't necessarily running from strict homes or broken families. They were simply living inside a youth culture that told them the world was theirs, that danger was something that happened somewhere else to someone else. And in that innocence, in that uniquely Californian openness, they walked straight into the gathering shadows without ever realizing how dark things could get. Charles Manson entered this world of peace and love. The young women who joined his family weren't outcasts or criminals. Some were daughters of privilege, products of suburbia, and children of Hollywood's elite. Among them was Deidre Shaw, daughter of the legendary Angela Lansbury, a girl who, like so many others, was drawn to the counterculture, but found herself entangled in Manson's web. Another, a bright-eyed surfer, traded her board for the bleak realities of the family. These California girls represented everything Charlie craved: beauty, youth, and access to power. But they were also more than the labels often applied to them. They were complex, idealistic, and rebellious. They sought freedom, but found captivity. They believed in love and community, but were twisted into pawns in a game they couldn't fully understand. This video explores how the California girls of Manson's family came to define not just the man, but an entire era. How did the bright promise of the 1960s become so synonymous with Manson's darkness? And what does their story say about the power of manipulation, the allure of rebellion, and the vulnerability of youth? Stephanie Gale Rowe was born on March 23, 1950, in Los Angeles. Little is known about her early life before she became associated with Charles Manson and his group, though other family members later noted that her mother was Jewish, one of several details that quietly contradicted Manson's later fixation on Nazi ideology. Rowe joined the family in the spring of 1968 and remained with them through that year, occupying a largely peripheral but persistent presence. She was described by Lynette Frome as having dark, curly hair and thick eyebrows, referring to her as the medieval sort, the tavern wench, buxom and shy, with surprising bursts of hilarity. Rowe first appears in official records during the April 1968 arrest of Manson and several followers in Ventura County, often referred to as the 9 Nude Hippies incident. At the time, she was booked under the alias Susan Scott. Shortly thereafter, Manson moved several of his group to Dennis Wilson's home, but when it was obvious the group was encroaching on Wilson's freedom, Manson then sent Mary Bruner, her infant son Valentine Michael, and several women north to Mendocino County. The plan was for the women to remain there for a few months, recruit young men, and avoid further scrutiny in Los Angeles. Stephanie Rowe was among those who traveled north with Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Ella Jo Bailey in the old black school bus. The group rented a home in Philo in Mendocino County, where they quickly obtained LSD and marijuana. The women then befriended 3 teenage boys in the area, sharing drugs and sex. When one of the boys experienced a severe LSD reaction, his mother contacted authorities. On June 22, 1968, police arrested the women, finding marijuana and LSD at the house. Mary Brunner was charged with narcotics possession, while Stephanie Rowe, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Ella Jo Bailey were arrested for prostitution. Women were held in custody, with Krenwinkel falsely claiming Valentine Michael as her child in an effort to protect Brunner from losing custody. The baby was temporarily placed with Manson's parole officer, Roger Smith, and his wife. By late July, Rowe and the others remained jailed, prompting Manson to attempt, unsuccessfully, to secure bail money through Dennis Wilson. The women, dubbed the Mendocino Witches by local police, were finally released on August 16, 1968, after 55 days in jail. Rowe returned south with the group, though the bus broke down en route. Her charges were formally dismissed on September 6, 1968, due to lack of evidence. Stephanie appears in at least one group photograph taken in Death Valley in the fall of 1968, but there is no further evidence that she remained with the Manson family. Today, Stephanie Rowe reportedly lives quietly in California and has declined public engagement about her past. When approached, her sister, an attorney, has discouraged further inquiry with potential legal action. Deidre Dee Angela Shaw was born on April 26, 1953 in Los Angeles, California, to acclaimed actress Angela Lansbury and her husband, producer Peter Shaw. Dee Dee grew up in Malibu with her older brother Anthony and her stepbrother David, in a household shaped by privilege, creativity, and frequent parental absence. Lansbury's career required extensive travel, and while both parents were loving and attentive when present, much of the children's daily life was managed by caretakers. In hindsight, Lansbury would reflect that this combination of freedom, money, and the permissive culture of Southern California in the 60s left her children vulnerable during their teenage years. By her early teens, Dee Dee had begun experimenting with drugs. What started as marijuana soon escalated, mirroring a broader pattern seen among many affluent teenagers in coastal California at the time. Lansbury later spoke candidly about this period, saying, "It started with cannabis but moved on to heroin, and at one stage Deidre was in with a crowd led by Charles Manson. She was one of many youngsters who knew him, and they were fascinated. He was an extraordinary character, charismatic in many ways, no question about it." Her words underscore an important distinction. Dee Dee was not a devoted follower or entrenched member of the Manson family, but rather part of a loose social orbit that brushed against Manson before his crimes made him infamous. Dee Dee encountered Manson through Malibu's overlapping teenage and countercultural circles, likely in early 1968. At that time, Manson and his small group were still largely perceived as eccentric drifters, musicians, and fringe spiritual seekers who moved between Topanga Canyon, Malibu, and other enclaves. Dee Dee met them through her friend Nancy Pittman, another teen from a similar background. Together, the girls occasionally visited the group, bringing food, clothing, drugs, and other supplies taken from their parents' homes. These gestures were typical of how many young people engaged with the family: casual, social, and rooted more in curiosity than ideology. Former family member Lynette Fromey later described Dee Dee as resilient, good-natured, and musically inclined, remembering afternoons when Dee Dee sat on the roof strumming a guitar while Manson listened. Manson remarked tenderly, "Look at her. She's 10 times the actress her mother is without even trying." The comment reveals both his flattery and his fixation on status. Dee Dee represented not just youth and charm, but proximity to celebrity, wealth, and legitimacy. For Manson, Dee Dee's value extended beyond her personality. Her access to her mother's credit cards provided food, clothing, and resources for the group for several months. Just as importantly, her presence fed Manson's fantasy that the children of Hollywood elites would eventually flock to him, lending him fame and influence. Yet this interest was transactional and fleeting. When Dee Dee's parents became aware of her drug use and associations, they acted decisively. By the summer of 1968, her credit cards were cut off, effectively ending her material support of the group. Manson's attention quickly shifted elsewhere. Despite this rupture, Dee Dee still hovered on the margins of the family for a time. In April 1969, she and another young woman picked up 17-year-old runaway Barbara Hoyt while driving through Canoga Park. They brought Hoyt to the Gresham Street house, where Manson and several followers were staying. Hoyt later recalled the evening as deceptively ordinary. Dinner shared on the floor, joints passed around, Manson playing guitar. This moment illustrates how recruitment often occurred not through coercion but through casual hospitality and the illusion of belonging. Crucially, Dee Dee never became a full-time member of the Manson family and was not involved in any known criminal activity associated with it. She continued living at home, attending school, and moving between worlds in a way that many less protected teens could not. Recognizing the escalating danger, Angela Lansbury made a life-altering decision. In 1970, she and Peter Shaw uprooted the family and moved Dee Dee and Anthony to County Cork, Ireland. Lansbury later explained that she chose Ireland because it offered distance from drugs, from Hollywood, and from the countercultural currents that had nearly swept her children away. She took a year off from acting to focus entirely on family life. The move proved pivotal. While the adjustment was not immediate or easy, Lansbury believed it saved her children's lives. She later said she had no doubt we would have lost one or both of our two if they hadn't been removed to a completely different milieu. Over time, both Dee Dee and Anthony stabilized, leaving behind the destructive pattern of their teens. In adulthood, Dee Dee built a quiet, independent life, far removed from the notoriety of her youth. She married a chef, and together they opened an Italian restaurant in Los Angeles, channeling creativity into food and hospitality rather than rebellion. Unlike many who crossed Manson's path, Dee Dee never faced arrest, prosecution, or public scandal. Her name survives in the historical record largely because of her mother's honesty and the brief, unsettling proximity she once had to a man who would soon embody one of America's darkest chapters. Deidre Dee Dee Shaw's story is not one of crime, but of near miss and intervention. She represents a class of young Southern California girls who were already there, privileged, curious, unmoored, drawn toward danger without fully understanding it. Thanks to swift parental action, her brush with Charles Manson became a warning rather than a tragedy, a footnote rather than a fate. Her mother, Angela Lansbury, died in October 2022. Nancy Laura Pittman was born on January 1st, 1951, in Malibu, California, the oldest child of an aerospace engineer and a socially prominent mother. She grew up in privilege, surrounded by money, stability, and expectations. Yet by her teens, she was already restless inside that world. Nancy surfed, sewed, and moved through Malibu with confidence. Petite, pretty, and tough, a girl who had learned how to hold her own among brothers and boys. She was sharp, headstrong, and stubbornly independent, qualities that would later make her indispensable to Charles Manson and dangerous to herself. Nancy's path into Manson's orbit came through Deidre Dee Dee Shaw, Angela Lansbury's teenage daughter. The two girls were close friends, and like many affluent teens in coastal Southern California, they were already experimenting with drugs and testing boundaries long before they met Manson. Just days after Dee Dee introduced Nancy to him in early '68, Nancy had a volatile fight with her parents and was thrown out of the family home. With nowhere else to go, she headed to Topanga Canyon and moved in with Charlie, Mary Brunner, Lynette Frome, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, Ella Bailey, Diane Lake, and Bruce Davis. Unlike many girls who drifted in and out of the family, Nancy stayed. She attached herself tightly to Manson and quickly proved herself useful. Lynette Frome later wrote that Nancy was tough, headstrong, and feisty, a scrapper with stick-to-itness. She was also an accomplished seamstress, a skill that earned her status inside the group. She later sewed Dennis Wilson's satin bed sheets into harem outfits. much to the fury of his housekeeper, and would go on to create clothing and symbolic items for Manson himself, including the infamous vest adorned with braided hair. Nancy was present for the family's early arrests and evasions. During the April 1968-9 nude hippies arrest in Ventura County, she gave police the false name Brenda McCann, one of several aliases she would use over the years. As the family expanded and tensions grew, Manson became increasingly paranoid about alliances forming without his control. Nancy's closeness with Paul Watkins and Diane Lake, Snake, did not go unnoticed. Charlie didn't go much for people teaming up, Watkins recalled. He was always breaking up little alliances. When the Mendocino witches were released after 55 days in jail, it was Nancy and Squeaky who drove north to pick them up, navigating breakdowns, delays, and Manson's growing agitation. Back at Spawn Ranch, Nancy's influence only deepened. She was both trusted and feared, capable, disciplined, and increasingly hardened. Nancy also played a role in introducing dangerous practices into the group. After Paul Watkins experimented with brewing belladonna tea from plants near Spawn Ranch, Nancy prepared her own batch. According to later testimony, her brew contributed to Tex Watson's intoxication and his arrest in April 1969. Nancy also took particular pleasure in theft, even robbing her own mother of expensive fur coats. The women cut the furs into strips and used them to decorate dune buggies, symbols of rebellion transformed into trophies of rejection. As the family escalated into the creepy crawls, Nancy became one of the most active participants. These nighttime home invasions, initially framed as performance art or spiritual exercises, quickly turned into burglaries and rehearsals for violence. In a letter to Squeaky, Nancy described the thrill she felt cutting locks off gates with bolt cutters, relishing the control and power it gave her. "I really got a big charge out of it," she wrote, connecting the act to childhood trauma of being locked in rooms. By the summer of 1969, Manson's control had curdled into terror. On July 20th, the day of the moon landing, he brutally attacked both Nancy and Gypsy Cher after a minor accident involving food supplies. The women witnessed firsthand how arbitrary and violent Charlie's authority had become. But still, Nancy remained loyal. In the early hours after the Tate murders on August 9th, 1969, it is believed the killers returned to Spawn Ranch to find Manson dancing outside with Nancy. Rumors persist that Manson revisited the crime scene with someone overnight. Nancy has been speculated, although others are more plausible. What is certain is that the week following the murders grew increasingly ritualistic and unhinged. On Manson's orders, Nancy cut the hair of the women, a symbolic stripping of identity and obedience. Only Patricia Krenwinkel was spared. The severed hair was woven into Manson's dune buggy and vest. After the murders and after the raid, as the family fled toward Death Valley, Nancy stole a green Ford sedan rented with a stolen credit card. During the October 1969 Barker Ranch raid, she was arrested under another alias, Sydette Perel. She later testified before the grand jury in December, but offered little of substance. During the pre-trial days in April 1970, Nancy married Bruce Davis in Nevada under another false name, Penelope Miller, while Davis signed as Mark Rollins Grant. The marriage was one of convenience, designed to prevent either from testifying at Bobby Beausoleil's trial. Despite technically being on the lam, Nancy was photographed on numerous occasions with other members of the family during the trial. But by December 2nd, 1970, both Nancy and Davis turned themselves in. What followed marked Nancy's final and most devastating descent. By 1972, Nancy was living in Stockton and later Gurneville with Priscilla Tuffy Cooper and Maria Crystal Alonzo. Through Manson's prison alliances with the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist criminal organization, Nancy became involved with Michael Lee Montfort, known as Red Eye, an escaped convict and AB associate. the women formed a tight domestic unit around violent men: Montfort, James Spider Craig, and William Goucher. The group then befriended James and Lauren Willett, a young couple from back east with an infant daughter. When James tried to leave the criminal activity, Montfort and Craig marched him into a field and executed him. Days later, Lauren was killed, either accidentally or deliberately, and her body hidden beneath the cabin in Stockton where they were staying. Nancy and Tuffy helped conceal the crime. Police eventually descended on the cabin after spotting Willett's stolen car. Nancy claimed she was babysitting the now orphaned Heidi Willett. When officers searched the property, they discovered Lauren's body buried under the house. The infant was placed in foster care, and the others arrested. Nancy was charged as a felony accessory to the murders. She served time in the California prison system. In 1976, she married Montfort despite his sentence. They had 3 sons together before his release, and then eventually divorcing in the early 1980s. Montfort would be arrested again for armed robbery, sentenced to an extraordinary 800 years in prison, and die behind bars in the 2000s. After Nancy's release from prison, she raised her boys first in the Napa Valley area, and then moved to Oregon, and finally to Hawaii, where she lives today with her 3rd husband. Her life is quieter now, but the damage ripples outward through victims and decades of consequences. Those consequences sadly extend to her own children. 2 of her 3 sons have spent years incarcerated for theft and violent crimes. Nancy Pittman, aka Brenda, was never just a follower. She was a facilitator, an organizer, a believer, and later an accessory to murder. Her story is not one of innocence lost, but of agency misused, of a young woman who had every advantage and chose darkness anyway. She did not merely orbit Charles Manson, she helped him hold his world together until it finally collapsed. The California girls of Charles Manson's family are more than footnotes in history. They are a cautionary tale of how the dream of freedom can so easily become a nightmare. They began as vibrant young women and teen girls, drawn to the promise of a new way of living, but they found themselves ensnared in a web of control, violence, and fear. Their beauty and privilege didn't protect them from the darkness. They made them targets of it. Manson's vision of fame and power relied on these girls, not just for their devotion, but for the image they projected to the world. They were his golden tickets, the embodiment of a counterculture he wanted to exploit for his own gain. And yet their rebellion, their complexity, and even their humanity have often been overshadowed by his notoriety. The story of these young women reminds us of the fragility of innocence and the dangerous charisma of those who prey on it. It's a reminder, too, of the duality of the 1960s, a decade defined by love and light, but also by the darkness lurking beneath its surface. As we reflect on the California girls of the Manson family, we must ask ourselves how this era, so full of promise, became a gateway to tragedy. What can we learn from their journey, from their dreams, their choices, and their fates? And how do we honor their humanity while grappling with the role they played in one of the darkest chapters of American history? In the next video, we explore the enigma of Bobby Beausoleil, convicted of the July 1969 murder of his friend, musician Gary Hinman. An artist, a convict, a man imprisoned longer than most for a single murder, his life raises questions about justice, redemption, and the enduring shadow of the Manson name. Is Bobby kept behind bars for what he did, or because of who he was associated with? And does his ever-changing tale reveal a man still searching for his truth, or simply evading it?